September 14th, 1974. A warehouse in Yazoo County, Mississippi. 2 brothers. 11 dead men. 6 hours that would become the FBI's most calculated massacre in Mississippi's blood-soaked history. And it all started with $8,500 and a dying father's humiliation. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about heroes. There are no heroes here. What you're about to hear involves extreme violence, systematic murder, and the kind of desperation that turns ordinary men into something else entirely. This is real. These were real people who died. Real families destroyed. If you're squeamish about true crime, about the darkest corners of human nature, this isn't for you. If you have the stomach for it, though, if you want to understand how desperation and a broken system can create monsters, hit that like button and subscribe. But I'm warning you, there's no going back from this one. This story will stay with you. YouTube, consider yourself notified. This is journalism, this is history, this is the truth about what happens when justice fails. Let's set the scene properly, because context matters. Yazoo County, 1974. 934 square miles of Delta flatland. 27,000 souls scattered across territory that felt like God had simply forgotten about it. Silver City, the nearest town to where our story unfolds, had exactly 400 residents. 400 people who knew everyone's business, everyone's shame, everyone's secrets. It was September, which in Mississippi means humidity that wraps around you like a wet blanket. 82 degrees that feels like 100. The air so thick you could practically chew it. Everything about that place felt abandoned, left behind by whatever progress the rest of America was making. While the rest of the country was reeling from Watergate, from Nixon's resignation just a month earlier on August 9th, Yazoo County was dealing with its own kind of decay. The cotton economy that had sustained the Delta for generations was collapsing. Corporate farms were swallowing up family land like a cancer. Small farmers were disappearing, and with them, a whole way of life was dying. This is where James Carter lived, 34 years old, 6'1", hands that knew their way around an engine better than most men knew their own wives. He'd come back from Vietnam in '69, carried the siege of Khe Sanh in '68 with him like a stone in his gut. Purple Heart for a wound that left a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of questioning the world. The war taught him things he wished he could forget, but those lessons, they had a way of staying useful. James lived with his father, Samuel, 68 years old, lungs destroyed by 43 years breathing cotton dust in the processing plants. Emphysema had him chained to an oxygen tank, every breath a battle he was slowly losing. But Samuel Carter, he'd spent his whole life teaching his son something that mattered more than breath. Honor. Your word is your bond. Respect isn't given, it's earned and maintained. 3 generations of Carters had lived by that code. In a world where you don't have much, your reputation is everything. Not money, not possessions. Your name, what it stands for. The Carters had 180 acres. Their grandfather had bought it in 1919, paid it off by 1927 through depression and drought and every hardship the Delta could throw at a man. That land was supposed to go to James and his brother Robert. That land was their inheritance, their future, their proof that hard work and integrity could build something lasting. But medical bills don't care about legacy. Emphysema treatment, oxygen tanks, medications that cost more than most men made in a month. Samuel needed things to breathe, and breathing costs money when your lungs are full of cotton dust. So James did what desperate men do. He borrowed money. February 1974, he walked into a card game at Turner's Warehouse on County Road 49. Every Saturday night, men gathered there. Poker, dice, whatever separated fools from their money. And running those games was Lucky Haynes, 52 years old, connected to the Dixie Mafia network that ran through the South like roots of a poisoned tree. Lucky didn't just run games, he was a loan shark, the kind that fed on desperation. James needed money fast. Lucky offered it, 22% interest monthly, but James didn't read the fine print. He needed $8,500 for his father's treatment. He signed whatever Lucky put in front of him. Signed it because his father needed to breathe, because family comes first, because that's what honorable men do. 7 months later, with compound interest eating through his life like acid, that $8,500 had become $23,000. James had been paying what he could, every spare dollar, but it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. And Lucky, he wasn't interested in money anymore. He wanted the land. 180 acres that had been in the Carter family for 55 years. Lucky had a quitclaim deed, a transfer document. All James had to do was sign over the property and the debt would disappear. March 15th, James went to Lucky, offered $12,000 in installments, everything he could possibly scrape together. Lucky laughed in his face, not just refused but laughed, mocked him in front of other men, made jokes about the dying old man who'd signed such a stupid contract. That was Lucky's mistake. He didn't just refuse the offer, he humiliated James Carter. And humiliation, for a man raised on honor and respect, that's gasoline waiting for a match. April through May, James tried every legal avenue he could find. He went to the sheriff's office in Silver City, laid out the whole situation. The deputy behind the desk barely looked up from his coffee. "Sounds like a civil matter, son. Get yourself a lawyer." A lawyer costs $5,000 just to start. $5,000 James didn't have, wouldn't have, couldn't imagine having. The law he was learning works real well if you can afford it. If you can't, you're just another poor bastard who should have read the fine print. Robert Carter, James's younger brother, watched all this happening. Bobby was 29, 5'10", worked as a mechanic alongside James at the county garage. Where James was quiet and calculating, Bobby was loyal to a fault. He worshipped his older brother, had followed him through everything since they were kids. When James enlisted, Bobby tried to follow but got rejected for a heart murmur that never bothered him a day in his life. While James was in the shit in Vietnam, Bobby was home working double shifts, sending money to their father, keeping the family land running. The brothers, they were two parts of the same machine. James was the mind, Bobby was the heart that beat for whatever James decided. Every Saturday night, that warehouse on County Road 49 came alive. Turner's place had been abandoned for years, an old cotton processing facility that nobody wanted anymore. Lucky Haynes had turned it into his kingdom. By 11 p.m., the parking area would be full of pickup trucks and beat-up sedans, 30, 40 men sometimes, crowding around card tables, shooting dice against the back wall, drinking bootleg whiskey that could strip paint. The air thick with cigarette smoke and desperation and the kind of masculinity that came from having nothing else to prove yourself with. Lucky ran these games with an iron fist wrapped in a smile. He knew every man's weakness, every debt, every secret. The Dixie Mafia wasn't like the Italian mob you saw in movies. It was more diffuse, more opportunistic. A network of criminals running stolen goods, loan sharking, illegal gambling through the South. Lucky was a mid-level operator, but in Yazoo County, he might as well have been Al Capone. Nobody crossed him. The few who tried found themselves in even worse trouble, or they just disappeared. Rural Mississippi in the 70s had a lot of empty spaces where problems could vanish. For James, watching Lucky hold court at that warehouse was like watching everything wrong with the world condensed into one smiling, backslapping man. Lucky drove a new Cadillac while people lost their homes. He wore rings on every finger while farmers ate beans and cornbread. He talked about honor and respect while destroying families with predatory loans. The hypocrisy of it burned in James's gut like battery acid. May turned into June. The medical bills kept coming. Samuel Carter was fading, not just his lungs, his spirit. He'd spent his whole life being a man who paid his debts, who stood on his own 2 feet, who never asked anyone for anything. Now he was watching his son drown trying to save him. The oxygen tank hissed in the corner like a timer, counting down to the inevitable. Samuel stopped talking much, just sat in his chair, breathing through plastic tubes, eyes full of something that looked like apology. June 15th, James went back to Lucky. This time he didn't offer money. He begged, literally got down and begged another man to show mercy, to show basic human decency. Lucky's response? He laughed, Called over some of his boys to witness it, made James repeat himself so everyone could hear. Tell them again how the old man signed without reading. Tell them how you want special treatment because your daddy's dying. Everyone's daddy dies, James. That's life. Robert had to physically pull James out of there that night. James's hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage so pure it had nowhere to go. In the truck on the way home, Bobby asked the question they were both thinking. What are we going to do? James didn't answer right away, just drove through the dark Delta night, past empty fields and shuttered farmhouses, past the wreckage of an economy and a way of life that was already dead, just hadn't fallen down yet. July arrived like a furnace. They sold everything that wasn't nailed down. James's truck, the Ford he'd bought new in '71, gone for $2,200. Every tool they owned, mechanics' tools worth twice what they got, but desperation makes terrible negotiators. Robert's motorcycle, furniture, anything with value. By the end of July, they had $8,900, close to the original debt. Maybe, they thought, maybe if they showed good faith, if they brought every penny they had. August 3rd, they walked into that warehouse in the middle of the afternoon, when only Lucky and a couple of his men were there, laid $8,900 in cash on the table, explained they'd sold everything. This was their life savings, their future, everything they had. Lucky didn't even count it, just pushed it back across the table. The contract says $23,000. You signed it. I don't do charity. That's when James noticed something, a detail he'd missed before in his desperation. His father's signature on the loan document, it didn't look quite right. Samuel had palsy in his hands from the emphysema medication, made his signature shaky but consistent. This signature looked too steady, too practiced. James took the document to a private investigator in Jackson, cost him $200 he didn't have. The investigator confirmed what James suspected. Forgery. Almost certain, but proving it in court would require expert witnesses, depositions, maybe $10,000 in legal fees. More money than the original debt. So Lucky hadn't just trapped them with impossible interest. He'd forged Samuel's signature, probably added terms after Samuel signed, maybe forged the whole thing from scratch. The contract was fake. The debt was based on fraud, but it was legal enough that proving otherwise would bankrupt them fighting it. The system, James realized, wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, working for people like Lucky against people like the Carters. August 25th, Pastor Williams from the Baptist Church tried to intercede. Went to see Lucky, appealed to whatever Christian values the man might have buried somewhere. Lucky threw him out, literally pushed a 60-year-old preacher out the door. This is business, Reverend. God doesn't have an office here. September 1st, an eviction notice arrived. 30 days to vacate the property. 180 acres, 3 generations of sweat and sacrifice would be sold at auction if they didn't sign it over. The notice was legal, filed properly, backed by that fraudulent contract. Samuel read the notice, said nothing, put it down, and stopped eating. Just stopped, like he'd decided that living through this particular shame wasn't worth the effort anymore. September 5th, James made a decision. It wasn't a moment of sudden rage or temporary insanity like the lawyers would later claim. It was cold, calculated, and absolutely final. He'd tried everything legal. He'd begged, negotiated, humiliated himself. The system had failed at every level. The sheriff wouldn't help. The courts were too expensive. The church was powerless. And Lucky Haynes kept smiling, kept running his games, kept destroying lives without consequence. So James decided there would be consequences. He would be the consequence. He told Bobby on a Tuesday night, sitting on the porch of their house, watching their father through the window struggling with his oxygen. "We're going to take care of this," James said, and Bobby knew immediately what he meant. Not because James explained, but because Bobby knew his brother, knew the tone, knew what came after all other options were exhausted. Bobby should have argued, should have tried to talk him down, find another way, anything else. Instead, he asked, when? Because for Bobby, the question was never if he'd follow James, only how far. They planned it like a military operation, which makes sense because James had spent 13 months in Vietnam watching Marine officers plan operations. Reconnaissance, asset acquisition, timing, contingencies. First, they needed weapons. You can't walk into a sporting goods store and buy the kind of firepower they needed for what James had in mind. But James knew where to get them. County Armory had an M16 from his National Guard unit and a Remington 870 shotgun. He had keys from his guard service, knew the security rotation, knew Tuesday nights the place sat empty with just a chain-link fence and one bored security guard who spent most of his shift sleeping in his car. September 7th, 3 in the morning, they cut the fence. In and out in 12 minutes. 2 weapons, 4 boxes of ammunition for the M16, 2 boxes of double-aught buck for the shotgun. James left his guard badge on the commander's desk. Not defiance, more like resignation. This was the end of that part of his life, and he knew it. For a week they watched Turner's warehouse, learned the pattern. Saturday nights were busy, 30 to 40 men, too many variables. But Lucky was there every night by 10 p.m., settling accounts, collecting debts, usually with 5 to 10 of his regular associates. Saturday had the most people, which meant the most witnesses to what Lucky really was, the most people who benefited from his predatory system. James wanted them all there. This wasn't just about Lucky anymore. It was about everyone who'd watched the Carters drown and done nothing, everyone who'd profited from Lucky's cruelty, everyone who'd let the system grind good people into dust. September 13th, Friday night. James and Bobby sat in their kitchen drinking Miller High Life, not saying much. Their father was in his chair, oxygen hissing, eyes closed but not sleeping. He knew something was coming. Fathers know. But he didn't ask because he already understood what desperation looked like, what it did to men. Samuel had lived through the Depression, watched good men do terrible things just to feed their families. He wasn't naive about human nature or what poverty and humiliation could create. Around midnight, James stood up, walked over to his father's chair, knelt down beside him like he was praying at an altar, put his hand on Samuel's arm, felt how thin it had gotten, how much the old man had faded. Samuel opened his eyes, looked at his son, saw everything there was to see. James wanted to say something profound, something that would explain, justify, make sense of what was about to happen. But there are no words for that moment when you tell your father goodbye, knowing you're about to commit atrocity in his name. So James just squeezed his father's arm, and Samuel squeezed back. Permission or forgiveness or just acknowledgement, James would spend the rest of his life not knowing which. They had a plan B. Mexico. If things went sideways, if they somehow got out of the warehouse alive and ahead of the law, they had a route mapped to the border, had sold enough that they could get across, disappear into Monterey or further south. It was fantasy, really, and they both knew it. This was a one-way trip. But having that backup plan, that sliver of maybe, it made what they were about to do feel slightly less like suicide. September 14th, 11:47 p.m. They pulled up to Turner's warehouse in Bobby's Chevrolet, the one thing they hadn't sold. 11 vehicles in the parking area, more than they'd expected. Saturday night crowd was bigger this week. Through the grimy windows, they could see shapes moving, hear the rumble of men's voices, smell cigarette smoke drifting out through gaps in the walls. James checked the M16. Made sure the safety was off, 30 rounds in the magazine. Bobby had the shotgun, hands steadier than you'd expect. They looked at each other one last time. No dramatic speeches, no movie moments. Just two brothers about to cross a line that had no way back across it. "Ready?" James asked. Bobby nodded. They weren't ready. Nobody's ever ready for something like this, but ready didn't matter anymore. They walked through that door at 11:53 p.m. 2 men with military weapons stepping into a room full of gamblers and criminals and people who'd done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lucky Haynes was at his usual table in the back, counting money. $47,000 would be recovered from that table later, $47,000 in dirty cash from predatory loans and rigged games. When Lucky looked up and saw James Carter holding an M16, his face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, recognition, dismissal, and finally, too late, fear. "Everyone shut up and sit down." James's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The room went silent except for some country song playing on a radio in the corner. 11 men scattered around that warehouse, ranging from Lucky's inner circle to casual players who just wanted to win some money gambling. They'd all die together. James walked straight to Lucky's table, weapon trained on the man who'd destroyed his family. "You remember me, Lucky? You remember laughing at me? You remember telling me how my daddy signed without reading?" Lucky tried to smile, tried to talk his way out like he'd talked his way out of everything his whole life. "Now, James, let's be reasonable here. We can work something out." James shot him in the knee. The sound of the M16 in that enclosed space was deafening, and Lucky's scream cut through the ringing in everyone's ears. "I brought a tape recorder," James said, pulling the small device from his pocket, setting it on the table. This wasn't rage. This was documentation. "You're going to tell the truth, Lucky, every bit of it. How you forged my father's signature, how you trapped him in that contract, every detail, because that's going on record." Lucky, bleeding, in shock, screaming, said everything, confessed to forging Samuel's signature on the original loan, admitted to adding clauses after Samuel signed, bragged about doing it to maybe 15 other families over the years, all of them too poor or too scared to fight back. He set it all into that tape recorder while 11 other men watched and realized they were witnessing something that couldn't have witnesses. When Lucky finished talking, blood pooling under his chair, tape recorder still running, James looked around at the other men in that warehouse. Some had their hands up, some were frozen, some were crying. "You're all wondering if you're going to die tonight," James said, voice flat, emotionless. "The answer is yes, every single one of you." Someone, Marcus Webb, it was later determined, tried to argue. "Jesus Christ, James, we didn't do anything. We just came here to play cards." Marcus was Lucky's friend, a deputy sheriff who'd looked the other way for years while Lucky destroyed families. He was also the one who'd delivered the eviction notice to the Carter house, had smiled while doing it. "You watched," James said. "All of you watched while Lucky destroyed families. Some of you helped, some of you profited. Some of you just didn't care enough to do anything about it. That makes you complicit. That makes you part of the machine that crushes people like my family." Vernon Tucker was there, Lucky's bookkeeper, the one who'd handled all the documentation, who'd probably helped forge signatures. Dale Morrison, who'd been at that March meeting when Lucky laughed at James's offer, who'd laughed along. 3 more of Lucky's regular associates, men who collected debts, intimidated families, did Lucky's dirty work. And 4 men who were just there to gamble, who'd never done anything to the Carters, who were simply in the wrong place at the worst possible time. What happened over the next 2 hours was methodical. That's the word the FBI would use later. Methodical. Not frenzied, not rage-driven, methodical. James and Bobby moved through that warehouse like they were working an assembly line. James would call a name, the man would beg or cry, or sometimes just accept what was coming. And then it was over. The M16 is a military weapon designed to kill efficiently, and that's exactly what it did. Some tried to run. The warehouse only had 2 exits, and Bobby was covering one while James worked. They didn't get far. Some tried to fight, but you can't fight a rifle with your hands. Some prayed, which seemed useless given the circumstances, but James didn't stop them. A few just sat there, perhaps thinking if they stayed still and quiet, they might be forgotten. They weren't. Vernon Tucker begged longest, offered information, money, anything. Said he had kids at home, a wife who needed him. James asked him how many families he'd helped Lucky destroy, how many kids had watched their fathers humiliated, their homes taken. Vernon didn't have an answer for that. Dale Morrison never said a word, just stared at James with hatred until the end. Marcus Webb cried and pleaded his innocence right up until he couldn't anymore. The 4 men who were just there to gamble, they went last. James knew their names from around the county. One worked at the feed store. One was a truck driver. They hadn't done anything specifically wrong except be there, except participate in Lucky's system, except benefit from an economy built on destroying people like the Carters. Were they guilty? By James's moral calculus, yes. By any reasonable standard, probably not. But reason had left the building hours ago. By 2:43 a.m., there were 11 bodies in Turner's warehouse. Bobby was sitting against a wall, shotgun across his lap, not looking at anything in particular. James methodically collected the documents from Lucky's table, the loan contracts, the ledgers showing all the other families Lucky had trapped. He dragged Lucky's body, the tape recorder still in his pocket, to an oil drum in the corner. added the documents, poured gasoline from a can they'd brought, lit it all on fire and watched it burn. The smell was apocalyptic. Burning flesh, burning paper, gasoline, cordite from all those rounds fired in enclosed space, and underneath it all, the copper tang of blood. So much blood that it was running in rivulets across the uneven warehouse floor. They stood there watching Lucky burn until he was nothing but ashes and bone fragments. Then they scooped the ashes out and scattered them in the field behind the warehouse, erasing him completely. They didn't run. That's the part that disturbed investigators most later. They had time. Hours before anyone would find the bodies, hours before the law would mobilize. They could have been across the state line, could have made a run for Mexico, could have at least tried. Instead, they sat on the hood of Bobby's Chevrolet, smoking cigarettes, watching the sun come up over the Delta on September 15, 1974. James later told the FBI agent who interviewed him that he'd known from the moment he walked through that door that this wasn't about escape. This was about making a statement, about showing what happens when you push desperate men too far, when the system fails so completely that violence becomes the only language anyone understands. Running would have undermined that. Running would have made it look like he thought he'd done something wrong. At 6:15 a.m., Sheriff Tom Patterson rolled up to the warehouse, responding to a call from a farmer who'd seen smoke the night before. He found two men sitting on a car, weapons on the ground beside them, covered in blood and gunpowder residue. Found 11 bodies inside, found evidence of execution-style murders, found a scene that would haunt him until he died 20 years later. James didn't resist, didn't say a word. Just put his hands behind his back when the sheriff asked, let himself be cuffed, climbed into the back of the patrol car like he was going to work, not to the worst decision of his life. Bobby followed suit, silent, obedient, already looking like a man who'd checked out of his own existence. At the station, James gave a full confession, every detail, every name, every shot fired, said he didn't regret it, didn't repent, didn't feel guilt. The system killed them, he told the detective. I just pulled the trigger. You want to blame someone. Blame everyone who knew what Lucky was doing and did nothing. Blame a system that protects predators and punishes victims. I'm just the consequence you all created. The trial lasted 11 days in October 1974. The prosecution argued premeditated mass murder, the worst crime in Mississippi history. The defense argued temporary insanity, a breakdown caused by systematic failure of legal and social systems. They brought in psychiatrists who talked about Vietnam trauma, about the stress of watching a parent die, about being pushed beyond rational limits. None of it mattered. The jury deliberated for 8 hours, came back with guilty on 11 counts of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. The judge sentenced James to 11 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Bobby got 11 life sentences with the possibility of parole after 35 years. October 10, 1974, they were processed into Parchman Farm, Mississippi's notorious state penitentiary. Samuel Carter died 6 weeks later. November 22nd, never having seen his sons again. The emphysema finally won its long battle, but really it was shame and heartbreak that killed him. He'd spent his whole life building something honorable, teaching his sons to be men of integrity. And in the end, he'd watched those sons become mass murderers in his name. That's a weight no oxygen tank can help you carry. James Carter died March 18, 2003. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. He'd spent 29 years in Parchman, walked into that place at 34, died at 63. Never filed an appeal, never asked for clemency, never expressed remorse in any form that would satisfy the parole board. His last words, according to the chaplain who sat with him, were, I saved my father's honor, but lost my soul. Even dying, he couldn't decide if what he'd done was justified or monstrous. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Robert Carter is still alive as of this recording. 79 years old now. He's been denied parole 3 times, 1999, 2009, 2019. Each time, families of the victims show up, talk about their loss, about how Bobby helped murder people who were just there to play cards. Bobby doesn't argue. Just sits there, says he understands their pain, says he'd vote against his own parole if he could. He's become something like a ghost in parchment, a man serving time not for what he did, but for who he chose to follow. Loyalty to James defined his whole life, and it'll define his death too. He'll die in prison. Everyone knows it. He knows it. The 180 acres that started everything, sold to distant relatives after Samuel died, then sold again to a corporate farming operation in 1982. Today, it's part of a 2,400-acre soybean plantation, industrial agriculture, machines doing the work, nobody living on the land itself. The house where the Carters lived for 3 generations was bulldozed in '85. Not a trace remains. Nobody in Yazoo County remembers the Carters anymore except as that dark story people mention when they're trying to prove Mississippi's reputation for violence. The families of the victims scattered after the trial. Lucky's widow moved to Memphis with their 2 daughters, died in 2009 of heart failure. The daughters changed their last name, wanted no connection to their father's legacy. Marcus Webb's widow stayed in Yazoo County, raised 3 kids alone, worked 2 jobs until she died in 2016. Vernon Tucker's family left the state entirely. Some of the other victims' families tried to sue the Carter estate, but there was nothing to take. No money, no assets, just debt and tragedy. The warehouse on County Road 49 stood empty for years, became a local haunted attraction for teenagers, until it burned down mysteriously in 1981. Probably kids smoking where they shouldn't, but some locals swore they could still hear screaming from that place even after it was gone. Trauma does that to communities, creates ghosts whether you believe in them or not. Here's what's interesting about the aftermath. For about a decade, loan sharking in the Delta region dropped significantly. Predatory lenders got more careful, offered slightly better terms, didn't push quite so hard. Banks were more willing to work with struggling farmers. It was like the whole region had learned a lesson about what happens when you squeeze desperate people too hard. But fear is temporary. Lessons fade. By the mid-'80s, new operators who hadn't lived through September 1974 were doing the same things Lucky did, just being smarter about it. The system that created the Carter brothers didn't change. It just got better at hiding its cruelty. Agent David Briggs from the FBI, who led the investigation, did an interview in 2015, 40 years after the massacre. He was retired, dying of COPD himself, ironically, and he said something that stuck with people. Legally, the Carter brothers deserved every year they got. They murdered 11 people in cold blood with premeditation. But morally, I don't know. I've worked 200 murder cases in my career, and this is the only one where I'm not sure justice was served. The law says they're guilty. My conscience doesn't know what to say. They were desperate men pushed past their breaking point by a system that failed them at every level. Does that excuse what they did? No. Does it explain it? Absolutely. That's the thing about this story. There are no heroes. Lucky Haynes destroyed families for profit, had no conscience, got exactly what he did to others. The Carter brothers murdered 11 people, some guilty, some just unlucky. Samuel Carter was a good man who accidentally signed something that doomed his family. The victims ranged from enablers of evil to innocent bystanders. The legal system worked exactly as designed, protecting the status quo even when the status quo was cruel. The community watched everything happen and did nothing until it was too late. The moral here, if there is one, is that revenge doesn't return what you lost, doesn't heal anything, just creates more bodies, more grief, more families destroyed. James saved his father's honor, but destroyed his father's heart. Won the battle, lost everything that mattered. But here's the question that keeps people up at night. What's the alternative? When the system breaks down, when there's no legal recourse, when honor and dignity are all you have left and someone's taking those too, what do you do? The Carter brothers chose violence. Most people would say that's the wrong answer. But what's the right one when all the right answers have already failed? This story doesn't have a neat conclusion, because life doesn't have neat conclusions. Monsters aren't born. They're created by systems that crush human dignity, by poverty that steals options, by humiliation that strips away everything except rage. The Carter brothers were murderers, also victims, Also, desperate men who tried every legal option before choosing the illegal one. All of these things are true simultaneously, and that's what makes this story so disturbing. We want clear good guys and bad guys. We want justice to be obvious. We want to know who to root for. This story offers none of that comfort. Just 11 dead bodies, 2 men in prison, a family destroyed, and questions about justice and revenge that have no good answers. The thing about killing that many people in one night is that after the first 3 or 4, something fundamental breaks in your humanity. James would tell a prison psychiatrist years later that the first shot, the one that took Lucky's life after the confession, that one he felt the kick of the rifle, felt the weight of ending a human life, felt something like satisfaction mixed with horror. The second man, Marcus Webb, the corrupt deputy who delivered that eviction notice with a smile, James felt that one too. Still present, still aware of the magnitude, but by the 5th or 6th, he said, it became mechanical. Point, shoot, move to the next, like harvesting crops, like any other task that needed completing. Bobby experienced it differently. Where James went cold and systematic, Bobby went somewhere else entirely. Dissociated, the psychiatrist would later call it. Bobby described it as watching himself from across the room, like he was a spectator to his own actions. The shotgun in his hands didn't feel like it belonged to him. The men pleading for their lives didn't sound real. Everything took on a dreamlike quality, muffled and distant, like watching television with the sound turned down. He did what James told him to do because following orders was easier than thinking about what those orders meant. Vernon Tucker begged for 18 minutes. 18 minutes of promising information, money, anything James wanted. Said he had 3 kids at home, ages 6, 8, and 10. Showed James a wallet photo, thought maybe humanizing himself would help. James looked at that photo of 3 smiling children and asked Vernon how many kids had watched their fathers humiliated and destroyed by the loans Vernon processed. Asked him if he'd ever thought about those children when he was forging signatures and trapping families. Vernon didn't have an answer. The photo stayed in his wallet when they found his body. Those 3 kids grew up fatherless because their father chose to work for a monster and convinced himself that just processing paperwork wasn't really hurting anyone. Dale Morrison never said a word, just stared at James with pure hatred from the moment the shooting started until the M16 ended his life. There was something almost admirable about it, James thought. No begging, no bargaining, no pretending he didn't know why this was happening. Just defiance and rage until the end. Morrison had been there in March when Lucky laughed at James's offer, had laughed along, had treated the destruction of the Carter family like entertainment. At least he owned it. At least he died honest about who he was. 3 of Lucky's regular associates went quickly. These were men who collected debts, who showed up at people's homes with threats, who'd perfected the art of intimidation. They knew the game they were playing, knew the risks. When James came for them, they accepted it with a kind of professional understanding. This was the violence they'd always implicitly threatened others with, just coming back around to them. You live by predatory loans and casual cruelty. You die by someone who got tired of being prey. The circle completes itself. But then there were the 4 who were just there to gamble. That's where it gets complicated, where the moral certainty James had constructed starts to crack. Willie Patterson worked at the feed store, 5 kids, came to the Saturday game twice a month to try to win enough for new school clothes. James knew Willie, had sold him parts at the county garage, always fair and friendly. Willie never hurt anyone, never profited from Lucky's system except maybe winning $20 here and there at cards. When James aimed the rifle at him, Willie didn't beg, just asked why. Not angry, just genuinely confused why he was about to die. James told him, "Because you're part of it, because you give Lucky legitimacy, because men like you showing up here every week makes it look normal, makes it look okay. You're not evil, Willie, but you're complicit, yes? And tonight, complicit is enough." James pulled the trigger while Willie was still trying to process that explanation, still trying to understand how playing poker made him deserve execution. Willie died confused, which might be the cruelest way to die. At least the others understood their role in the tragedy. The last man James killed was 19 years old. Name was Tommy Reeves, someone's nephew who'd driven down from Memphis, first time at Lucky's game, didn't even know what he was walking into. Tommy had been asleep in a corner when the shooting started, woke up to carnage, and tried to hide behind some crates. James found him at 2:37 a.m., 3 hours into the massacre. Tommy was crying, saying over and over, "I don't even know these people. I just got here. Please, please, I don't even know these people." Bobby, who'd been mostly silent all night, spoke up then. Said, "James, he's telling the truth. He doesn't know anything. He's just a kid." James looked at his brother, looked at this terrified teenager, looked at the 10 bodies already cooling around the warehouse, and he shot Tommy anyway. Because by that point, mercy would have been arbitrary. Saving one while killing 10 didn't make anything better. Either everyone dies or the whole thing is pointless. Either you commit completely to your vengeance or you're just a murderer without conviction. James had crossed so far past the line that turning back wasn't possible, wasn't even conceivable. Tommy Reeves died because James Carter needed his massacre to be complete, needed it to be absolute, needed it to make a statement that couldn't be questioned or misunderstood. When it was over, when all 11 bodies lay scattered across that warehouse floor, James and Bobby stood in the silence. The radio had stopped playing at some point, battery died, or someone hit it during the chaos. Just silence and the smell of death and gun smoke so thick it made breathing difficult. Bobby was shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline crash, from what happens when your body realizes the threat is over but can't stop producing the chemicals that kept you functional during crisis. James wasn't shaking, wasn't feeling much of anything. He later described it as emptiness, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made him human, left just a shell walking around. He'd felt more emotion in Vietnam, more connection to his own actions. There, at least, you could tell yourself it was war. It was them or you. It was protecting your brothers in arms. This wasn't war. This was revenge dressed up as justice, murder dressed up as revolution. They dragged Lucky's body to that oil drum, the one they'd prepared earlier, filled with scrap wood and gasoline. Lucky weighed maybe 180, dead weight is heavy, and it took both of them to get him positioned. James pulled the tape recorder from his pocket, rewound it, listened to Lucky's confession one more time. The voice coming out of that small speaker, admitting to forgery, to predatory lending, to destroying families, it sounded hollow now. What had seemed important hours ago, what had seemed like proof that justified everything, now just sounded like one criminal confessing before being murdered by another criminal. James threw the tape recorder into the drum with Lucky's body, added all the documents from Lucky's table, the loan contracts, the ledgers, the evidence of his crimes, poured gasoline over everything, struck a match and watched it all burn. The smell of burning human flesh is unlike anything else. It's sweet and rotten simultaneously, thick enough to taste, persistent enough to haunt you for years. Bobby turned away and vomited into the corner. James just watched until there was nothing left but ashes and bone fragments small enough to scatter in the wind. They scooped the ashes, still hot enough to burn through the work gloves they wore, and carried them out to the field behind the warehouse, scattered them in the dirt where cotton used to grow before the corporate farms took over. Lucky Haynes became part of the Delta soil, no different from all the men who'd worked that land for generations. No marker, no grave, no memory. James had wanted to erase him completely, and in that, at least, he succeeded. By 3 a.m. they were done. The warehouse looked like something from a war zone, which in a way it was. This was economic warfare played out with military weapons, class struggle resolved through violence, the kind of thing that happens when social safety nets fail and desperation becomes weaponized. They could have run then, should have run. The border was 8 hours south, Mexico another 6 beyond that. They had enough gas money, had that plan they'd made about disappearing into Monterey, starting over. But James walked out to the parking area and sat on the hood of Bobby's Chevrolet. Pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lit one, and watched the eastern sky start to lighten from black to dark blue to that pre-dawn gray that promises morning. Bobby sat beside him, both of them covered in blood and gun smoke residue, both of them knowing exactly what was coming. They didn't talk. What was there to say? They'd murdered 11 people. Nothing changes that. No words make it better or worse or different. The sun came up over Yazoo County on September 15, 1974, same as it had every day before, same as it would every day after. The Delta doesn't care about human tragedy. The land just keeps existing, keeps growing soybeans or cotton or whatever crop the current farmers plant, keeps being flat and hot and indifferent to whoever lives or dies on it. James watched that sunrise and thought about his father, probably awake now back home, oxygen tank hissing, knowing his sons weren't coming back. Thought about whether saving his father's honor was worth 11 lives. Couldn't come up with an answer then. Never would. Sheriff Patterson arrived at 6:15, found them sitting there like men waiting for a bus, found the weapons on the ground, found the bodies inside, found a scene that would define the rest of his career and haunt him into retirement. Tom Patterson was a decent man, as sheriffs go, had served in Korea, knew what combat looked like. This wasn't combat. This was execution. This was something darker and colder than war. He cuffed them both without incident, read them their rights, put them in the back of his patrol car. On the drive to the station, James spoke for the first time in hours, said to Patterson, "We tried everything legal, Tom. You know we did. I came to this office in April, laid it all out, and your deputy told me it was a civil matter. What's a man supposed to do when the law won't protect him?" Patterson didn't answer, just kept driving, but his hands tightened on the wheel. Because James was right. The system had failed. Everyone knew Lucky was a predator. Everyone knew he was destroying families. And everyone, including law enforcement, had decided it wasn't their problem until someone made it their problem with military weapons. At the station, James gave his confession with the same mechanical precision he'd used to kill 11 men. Every detail, every name, every decision point. The detective recording it kept expecting James to show emotion, to break down or get angry or show some human response. Nothing. Just facts delivered in monotone, like reading a grocery list. When asked if he regretted his actions, James said, "I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret doing what was necessary." Bobby's confession was shorter, mostly just confirmed everything James said, added that he'd followed his brother because that's what brothers do, because he trusted James's judgment more than his own, because loyalty mattered more than morality. The detective asked if James had forced him to participate. Bobby actually laughed at that, first emotion he'd shown since the arrest. "Force me? No. James gave me a choice. I chose to follow him. I chose this. Don't try to make me a victim." News of the massacre spread through Yazoo County like wildfire through dry grass. 11 bodies, the Carter brothers, Lucky Haynes and his organization destroyed in one night. Initial reactions were mixed, which tells you something about how Lucky was perceived. Some people were horrified, called it the worst crime in Mississippi history, demanded the death penalty. Others, quietly, in conversations they'd deny later, said Lucky had it coming, said the Carter brothers did what needed doing, said maybe this would teach predatory lenders to think twice. The state attorney general took over prosecution personally. This was too big, too visible to leave to county prosecutors. They charged both brothers with 11 counts of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. Maximum penalty in Mississippi in 1974 wasn't death, despite what people think. It was life without parole, which some would argue is worse. Dying takes a moment. Life without parole is dying slowly over decades, watching yourself age in a cage, becoming irrelevant to a world that moves on without you. The defense team, appointed because the Carters had no money for private attorneys, went with temporary insanity caused by extreme emotional distress, argued that James Carter was a decorated veteran suffering from untreated PTSD, that the systematic failure of legal systems to address Lucky's predatory lending had created a pressure cooker situation, that any reasonable person subjected to the same circumstances might snap. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about Vietnam trauma, about grief over a dying parent, about the psychological effects of prolonged financial stress. The prosecution didn't have to work hard. They just showed photos of the crime scene, showed the methodical nature of the killings, the planning that went into acquiring weapons, the time between murders that proved this wasn't a moment of rage, but calculated execution. They read names of the victims, brought in family members. Willie Patterson's oldest daughter testified about her father, about how he was just trying to win money for school clothes, about how the house felt empty without him. Tommy Reeves's mother talked about her only son, 19 years old with his whole life ahead, killed for being in the wrong place. The trial lasted 11 days. The courtroom was packed every single day. Standing room only, people drove from surrounding counties to watch. This was the biggest thing to happen in Yazoo County since Reconstruction. Media from Jackson and Memphis camped outside. The Carter brothers sat at the defense table looking like they'd already accepted their fate. Bobby watched the proceedings with detached interest, like it was happening to someone else. James took notes, corrected factual errors when his attorney got details wrong, treated the trial like a historical record that needed to be accurate. On October 8th, the jury got the case. 12 people from Yazoo County, people who knew Lucky's reputation, who might have been victims of predatory lending themselves, who understood the desperation the Carters felt. The prosecution thought conviction was guaranteed, but worried about sentencing, worried this jury might go easy. They deliberated for 8 hours. Came back at 11 p.m., everyone exhausted, everyone knowing this verdict would define how Yazoo County saw itself. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder times 11, aggravating circumstances because of the planning, the multiple victims, the brutality of execution. The judge scheduled sentencing for the next day, didn't want this dragging out, didn't want more media circus than necessary. The Carter brothers showed nothing when the verdict was read. Bobby kept his eyes on the table. James looked at the jury, nodded once, like thanking them for honest work. Sentencing was brief. The judge, Harold Whitmore, was a lifelong Mississippian who'd seen violence before, but nothing like this. He gave a speech about justice and law and societal order, said he understood the Carters felt wronged, but that civilization depends on legal recourse, not vigilante violence, that if everyone who felt victimized took matters into their own hands, society would collapse into anarchy. The speech was meant for history, for the record, for justifying what everyone knew was coming. James Carter, 11 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, would die in prison, period. Robert Carter, 11 consecutive life sentences with possibility of parole after 35 years, technically eligible for release in 2009 when he'd be 64 years old. Practically, with 11 murder convictions, parole was unlikely, but at least the possibility existed, some thread of hope, however thin. October 10, 1974, they were transferred to Parchman Farm, Mississippi State Penitentiary. Parchman in the 70s was still operating like a plantation, inmates doing agricultural labor, guards who'd worked there since segregation days, violence both official and inmate inflicted that made Vietnam look organized. James and Bobby were separated, different cell blocks, different work details. The state didn't want them together, didn't want them forming their own little army inside. 6 weeks later, November 22nd, Samuel Carter died at home. The oxygen tank still hissing in the corner, morphine finally doing what emphysema had been working toward for years. He'd refused to see his sons after their arrest, refused to attend the trial, refused to read their letters. Samuel had spent his whole life building a reputation for honor and integrity, and his sons had destroyed it in one night. The shame killed him faster than the disease. His last words to the hospice nurse were about the land, about how it was supposed to go to his sons, about how everything he'd built meant nothing now. They didn't let James attend the funeral. Security risk, they said. Bobby requested permission and was denied for the same reason. So Samuel Carter was buried in Silver City Cemetery with maybe 20 people attending, mostly elderly friends and distant relatives. No sons, no grave marker mentioning James or Robert. Like the Samuel had never had children, like the Carter bloodline ended with him. In a way, it did. Neither brother would have children, neither would pass on the family name. The land, the legacy, the 3 generations of work, all of it ended on September 14th when James walked into that warehouse with an M16. The first years in Parchman were brutal. James ended up in maximum security, isolated most of the time because he'd killed a law enforcement officer, and that made him a target. Marcus Webb had been a deputy sheriff, and in prison, that matters. Corrections officers looked the other way, while other inmates tried to exact their own justice. James fought back with the same cold efficiency he'd used that night in the warehouse. Within 2 years, he'd survived 3 assassination attempts and killed 2 inmates in self-defense. They stopped trying after that. He became something like an untouchable, respected in the way prisoners respect someone who absolutely will not be victimized no matter the cost. Bobby had it worse in some ways, better in others. He was in general population, working the farm fields like it was 1865. Hard labor under Mississippi's sun, getting older and weaker every year. But Bobby found something James never did. Remorse. Genuine, soul-crushing remorse. Bobby started attending every church service the prison offered, got baptized 3 times by 3 different denominations, like he was trying to wash away the blood through sheer repetition. Wrote letters to victims' families apologizing. Most were returned unopened, but he kept writing. Bobby wanted forgiveness. James wanted nothing except to survive each day. James Carter died March 18, 2003. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed too late to treat, spread everywhere by the time they caught it. Parchman's medical facility was minimal, basically palliative care until the end. The chaplain, Father McCarthy, spent the last week with James, trying to get him to make peace with God, with himself, with what he'd done. James refused last rites, refused confession, refused absolution. But on his final day, conscious but fading, he said to McCarthy, "I saved my father's honor but lost my soul. I still don't know if it was worth it." Those were his last words. Died at 2:15 p.m., 29 years into his sentence, 3 decades after September 14th changed everything. They buried him in the prison cemetery, a plot marked only with a number, not a name. No family claimed the body. Bobby submitted a request to attend the funeral and was granted permission under guard. Stood there in shackles watching his brother lowered into Mississippi dirt, thinking about how James had always been the strong one, the decisive one, the leader. Now, James was gone, and Bobby was alone, serving time for decisions someone else made that he chose to follow. Robert Carter is 79 years old now. He's eligible for parole, has been since 2009. He's been denied 3 times. 1999, first hearing. Families of the victims showed up in force. Willie Patterson's daughter, now in her 40s, stood before the parole board and said, "My father died because he played cards. That's it. He played cards and this man shot him. I don't care how sorry he is. Sorry doesn't bring back my father. Keep him locked up until he dies." Bobby sat there and took it, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. The board denied parole unanimously. 2009, second hearing. The room was less crowded. Some of the victims' families had died or moved on or decided they'd spent enough of their lives on this. But Tommy Reeves's mother was there, older now but still angry. "My boy was 19. 19. He didn't do anything, didn't even know these people. And this man killed him anyway. Killed a child. And you think maybe he should go free? No. Absolutely not." Denied again. 2019, third hearing. Bobby is 74 by now, health failing, probably has 5, maybe 10 years left anyway. His attorney argues compassionate release, argues he's no longer a threat, argues he's served 45 years and shown genuine remorse. The parole board room is almost empty. Most of the victims' families are dead or too old to travel. But one person is there, Marcus Webb's granddaughter, representing a family Bobby helped destroy. She's younger, wasn't even born when the massacre happened, but she stands up and says, "My grandfather was complicated. Maybe he was corrupt, but he was still my mother's father, still a human being, and letting his murderer out doesn't fix anything. It just says that if you wait long enough, murder has a statute of limitations." Denied one more time. Bobby will die in prison. Everyone knows it. He knows it. His next parole hearing is scheduled for 2029, when he'll be 84 if he lives that long. The board will deny it again, because some crimes don't get forgiven, some debts can't be paid, some consequences are permanent. Bobby writes letters to the families still, has written thousands over the years. Most go unanswered. A few write back, usually to tell him to stop, to leave them alone, to let them forget. One letter from Willie Patterson's youngest daughter said something Bobby thinks about every day. "You took away my father, but you also took away your own life. I got to live, fall in love, have children, see the world. You got to sell and regret. Maybe that's justice enough." The 180 acres that started everything got sold to distant Carter relatives after Samuel died. They held it for 8 years, rented it out to corporate farms, eventually sold it in 1982 to Monsanto subsidiary for developing. The house was bulldozed in '85. Every structure, every fence, every evidence that Carters had lived there for 3 generations, gone. Graded flat and incorporated into a massive soybean operation that now covers 2,400 acres. Industrial agriculture, automated systems, maybe 5 employees managing land that used to support 50 families. Drive past it today and there's nothing. Just endless rows of identical crops stretching to the horizon, occasional equipment scattered around. No houses, no people, no history. The Delta is full of places like that now, where family farms used to be, where communities existed, where people built lives. All gone, replaced by efficient food production that serves national distribution networks. The land the Carter brothers killed for, that their grandfather bought in 1919, that represented their family's entire legacy. It doesn't even have a marker. Nobody driving County Road 49 knows that's where the Carter place used to be. It's just field number 7 in the southeastern quadrant of a corporate farm's property map. The families of Lucky's victims scattered after the trial. Lucky's widow, Margaret, moved to Memphis with their 2 daughters. The girls were 8 and 11 when their father was murdered, old enough to remember him, but young enough that memory could be rewritten. Margaret never remarried, worked as a secretary, raised her girls alone. She died in 2009 of heart failure, stress, and grief compounding over decades until her heart literally gave out. The daughters both changed their last name as adults, wanted no connection to Lucky Haynes, wanted to escape the stigma of being related to a man whose murder spawned the worst massacre in Mississippi history. One moved to California, the other to Oregon. Neither has been back to Mississippi since their mother's funeral. Marcus Webb's widow, Janet, made a different choice. She stayed in Yazoo County, stayed in the same house she'd shared with Marcus, raised their 3 children alone in the place where everyone knew her as the corrupt cop's wife. She worked 2 jobs, cleaned houses during the day and waitressed at night, made sure her kids graduated high school, put all 3 through community college on sheer will and determination. Janet died in 2016 at 78. Her funeral had maybe 100 people, which in Silver City is enormous. Turned out she'd quietly helped dozens of families over the years, never asking for recognition, never bringing attention to herself. Her children spoke at the funeral about how she refused to be defined by the worst thing that happened to her, refused to let her husband's death and complicated legacy destroy her family. That's strength most people don't have. Vernon Tucker's family left Mississippi entirely. His widow and 3 kids moved to Ohio, where she had relatives, changed their name, tried to forget everything about Yazoo County. The kids grew up hearing nothing about their father, nothing about what happened. The youngest daughter found out by accident in college when she was researching Mississippi history for a class and came across the Carter brothers massacre. Recognized names, dates, realized the Vernon Tucker who begged for his life was her father. She dropped out of school, had a breakdown, spent 2 years in therapy trying to reconcile the father she'd been told died in a car accident with the reality that he was executed for being a predatory lender's bookkeeper. Some truths are too heavy to carry. The other victims' families handled it in their own ways. Some found religion. Some found alcohol. Some found nothing and just existed with a hole where a person used to be. Willie Patterson's family, the 5 kids and a widow, stuck together. They started a small scholarship fund in Willie's name for kids from low-income families, funded it by nickel and diming, having bake sales and car washes, turning their grief into something that helped others. It wasn't much, maybe $300-500 scholarships a year, but it was something. It was evidence that Willie had existed, that his life mattered for more than how it ended. Here's what's interesting about the aftermath in Yazoo County. For about 10 years after the massacre, loan sharking and predatory lending practically disappeared. Banks got more flexible with struggling farmers. Private lenders offered better terms, didn't push as hard for repayment. It was like the entire financial community looked at what happened to Lucky Haynes and decided maybe squeezing desperate people until they broke wasn't worth the risk. Fear changed behavior where law and ethics had failed. But fear is temporary. Lessons fade. People who lived through September 1974 got older, moved away, died. New people came in, new lenders who hadn't seen the bodies, hadn't felt the shock, hadn't learned that particular lesson. By the mid-'80s, predatory lending was back. Different faces, same system. Maybe slightly more sophisticated, maybe better at hiding behind legal language, but fundamentally unchanged. The economic structures that created the Carter brothers' desperation, they didn't get reformed. They just got better at camouflage. Agent David Briggs from the FBI led the investigation into the massacre, spent 3 weeks in Yazoo County in September and October 1974, interviewed everyone, reconstructed the timeline, built the case. It was his biggest case in a 25-year career that included mob hits and domestic terrorism. Briggs retired in 1995, moved to Florida, spent his retirement fishing and trying to forget some of the things he'd seen. But in 2015, a journalist doing a documentary on the Carter brothers tracked him down, asked for an interview. Briggs agreed, partly because he was dying of COPD and figured his perspective should be on record, partly because he'd carried uncertainty about that case for 40 years. What he said in that interview became the most quoted analysis of the Carter brothers' massacre. Legally, they deserved every year they got. They murdered 11 people in cold blood with extensive premeditation. That's first-degree murder 11 times over. There's no legal ambiguity. But morally? I don't know. I've investigated over 200 homicides in my career. This is the only one where I'm not certain justice was served. Not because I think they should have walked free, but because the system that pushed them to that breaking point never faced consequences. Lucky Haynes was destroying families for years. Everyone knew it. Law enforcement knew it. The courts knew it. Nobody did anything until 2 desperate men did something permanent. Briggs continued. The Carter brothers were murderers. That's not in dispute. But they were also victims of a predatory economic system that treats poor people as raw material to be exploited. Both things are true simultaneously. That's what makes this case disturbing. We want clear good guys and bad guys. We want obvious villains and heroes. This gives us neither. Just victims creating more victims, desperation metastasizing into violence, a total system failure that ended with 11 people dead and 2 brothers caged for life. The interviewer asked Briggs if the Carter brothers could have done anything differently. Long pause then. Of course, they could have walked away, let the land go, started over somewhere else, accepted that sometimes the bad guys win and there's nothing you can do about it. Most people in their situation would have done exactly that, swallowed the injustice and moved on because that's what functional adults do. But James Carter wasn't most people. He had this rigid code of honor inherited from his father, from his grandfather, from a culture that teaches men their word and their reputation are everything. That code doesn't allow for walking away. It demands resolution even if resolution means destroying yourself in the process. That interview with Briggs got maybe 10,000 views on YouTube. The documentary it was part of never found distribution. This story, one of the most disturbing true crime cases in American history, remains mostly forgotten. Occasionally it'll pop up on a Reddit thread about extreme cases of vigilante justice, sometimes in academic papers about socioeconomic factors in violent crime. But mostly it's forgotten, which is perhaps appropriate. Some stories are too complicated for easy consumption, too morally ambiguous for the true crime genre that demands heroes and villains. The massacre fundamentally changed nothing. That's the hardest truth. 11 people died. 2 men spent their lives in prison, multiple families destroyed, and the systems that created the conditions for all that suffering? Unchanged. Predatory lending still exists, just with better PR. Rural poverty still grinds people down until they're desperate. The legal system still works better for people who can afford lawyers. The basic injustices that broke James and Robert Carter, they're still breaking people today, just in less spectacular ways. If this story has a moral, it's this: revenge doesn't heal anything, doesn't bring back what you lost, doesn't fix broken systems, just creates more bodies, more grief, more families destroyed. James Carter thought he could save his father's honor through violence. Instead, he destroyed his father's heart, killed his father's will to live, ensured the Carter name would be associated with massacre rather than integrity. Won the battle, lost everything that mattered. But here's the question that keeps people awake at night once they really think about this case. What's the alternative? When the legal system fails you, when every legitimate avenue has been exhausted, when your choice is between accepting complete destruction of everything you value or fighting back, what do? Most people say violence is never the answer. Most people are probably right. But most people have never been pushed as far as James Carter was pushed. Most people haven't watched their dying father humiliated by a system that protects predators and punishes victims. The Carter brothers chose violence, chose to murder 11 people, including some who were arguably innocent, chose to destroy their own lives in their father's final days for the sake of revenge they convinced themselves was justice. That's monstrous. It's also human. Both things can be true. That's what makes this story so disturbing, so difficult to process. We want neat categories: good people, bad people, heroes, villains, justice, injustice. This story refuses those categories, exists in the gray area where desperation and broken systems create monsters out of ordinary men. James Carter was a mechanic, decorated veteran, devoted son. He was also a mass murderer who killed people in their sleep, who shot a teenager begging for his life, who chose vengeance over every other possible response. Robert Carter was a loyal brother, hard worker, man who showed genuine remorse, also someone who helped execute 11 people, who stood guard while his brother killed, who chose blind loyalty over moral clarity. Samuel Carter was a good man destroyed by medical debt and predatory lending. Also someone whose rigid code of honor made violence seem like the only option that preserved dignity. Lucky Haynes destroyed families for profit without remorse. Also a father who loved his daughters, a husband his wife genuinely mourned. Marcus Webb was a corrupt cop who enabled Lucky's predation. Also a father who coached Little League and helped elderly neighbors with yard work. Vernon Tucker processed fraudulent paperwork that ruined lives, also worked 2 jobs to support 3 kids, and volunteered at his church. Willie Patterson was just trying to win money for school clothes. Tommy Reeves was 19 and in the wrong place at the wrong time. None of these people were simple. All of them were human. All of them are dead or destroyed because systems failed and desperation found a gun. That's the real story here. Not the massacre itself, though that's dramatic enough. The real story is how American capitalism in the 1970s rural South created conditions where a decent man could become a monster, where violence could seem like the only language anyone understood, where justice and revenge became indistinguishable. We like to think we've moved past that. The Delta is different now, right? More regulated, more oversight, more safety nets. Except rural poverty is worse. Medical debt still bankrupts families. Predatory lending exists, but we call it payday loans and title pawns and subprime mortgages. The basic mechanisms that destroyed the Carter family, they're still operational, still grinding people down, still creating desperation that occasionally explodes into violence. The lesson of the Carter brothers, if there is one, is that monsters aren't born. They're created. Created by systems that prioritize profit over people, by communities that watch suffering and do nothing, by legal structures that protect the powerful and abandon everyone else. James Carter wasn't a psychopath. He was an ordinary man pushed past endurance by circumstances that should never have existed. That should terrify us more than any individual murderer ever could, because it means under the right conditions, or rather, the wrong conditions, any of us could be James Carter. Any of us could reach that point where violence seems not just justified, but necessary. The warehouse on County Road 49 burned down in 1981, probably teenagers smoking where they shouldn't. Some locals claimed it was haunted, that you could hear screaming on quiet nights. Trauma does that to places, creates ghosts whether you believe in them or not. The site is empty now, overgrown with kudzu and brambles, no marker indicating what happened there. Just like the Carter land has no marker, just like most of the victims have graves that family stopped visiting years ago. Forgetting is easier than remembering, easier than sitting with the complexity, the moral ambiguity, the uncomfortable truth that this story has no heroes, no villains, just humans failing in human ways with catastrophic results. September 14, 1974. 2 brothers, 11 dead men. 6 hours that changed everything and nothing. The victims are mostly forgotten. The killers are dying or dead in prison. The systems that created the whole tragedy continue unchanged. And somewhere in Yazoo County, soybeans are growing on land that used to mean something to someone, land that 3 generations of Carters died for in different ways, land that nobody remembers or cares about anymore because memory is expensive and forgetting is free. That's the real horror of this story. Not the violence, though that's horrible enough. The real horror is the absolute meaninglessness of it all. 11 people died, 2 lives spent in cages, multiple families destroyed. And for what? Nothing changed, nothing improved. The sacrifice bought nothing. The violence achieved nothing except more suffering. James Carter saved his father's honor but lost his soul, and in the end, neither honor nor soul mattered, because everyone forgot anyway. The Delta keeps growing crops. The sun keeps rising. Time moves on. And the story of 2 desperate brothers and 11 dead men slowly fades into the particular kind of forgetting reserved for truths too uncomfortable to remember.